In the crisp autumn of 1999, three college students, Liam, with his dog-eared book of poetry, Chloe, whose laughter could echo through a canyon, and Ben, the quiet cartographer of the group, vanished into the sprawling, indifferent wilderness of a Blackwood National Forest. They were on a week-long trek, a final adventure, before the pressures of their senior year at Northwood University. They had packed for every contingency, or so they thought. They left behind a detailed itinerary, a trail of hopeful goodbyes, and a void that would soon swallow an entire community. The initial search was one of the largest in the state's history. Hundreds of volunteers, led by state police and park rangers, combed the rugged terrain for weeks. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their rotors chopping the cold mountain air, while search dogs worked the forest floor until their paws were raw. Every theory was floated in the hushed conversations of the command post and the sensational headlines of the local news. They took a wrong turn and succumbed to an early, unexpected blizzard. They were attacked by a bear or a mountain lion. Perhaps, as one darker rumor suggested, they had simply run away to start new lives, leaving a cruel mystery in their wake. A young, determined state trooper named Miles Corbin was part of that search, his face raw from the wind and his spirit eroding with every fruitless day. He remembered the desperate faces of the parents, the maps covered in grids that yielded nothing, and the charismatic leadership of a local businessman, Alastair Finch, who had organized the civilian volunteers with stunning efficiency. Finch was everywhere, offering resources, coffee, and resolute encouragement. He was a beacon of hope in a sea of despair. But hope, like the daylight in those late autumn months, faded quickly. The search was eventually scaled back, then officially called off. The case files for Liam, Chloe, and Ben were stamped with the grim, final word: cold. The forest kept its secrets, and the world moved on, leaving only three families locked in a permanent, agonizing state of not knowing. The mystery of the Blackwood Three became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered to new generations of hikers. But 20 years later, on a sun-scorched August morning in 2019, the silence of the mountains was about to be shattered. A construction crew, working for Finch Enterprises, was clearing ground for the foundation of a new luxury ski resort, a project championed by the now venerable philanthropist Alastair Finch himself. A foreman named Dave sat in the air-conditioned cab of his excavator, the machine's massive steel bucket gouging deep into the earth. He was leveling a stubborn patch of ground on the edge of what was once a protected watershed, land that had only recently been rezoned for development. He felt a jarring thud, a metallic clang that was different from the usual sound of rock. Cursing under his breath, he lowered the bucket and climbed down to inspect the obstruction. It was a metal-framed backpack, its nylon fabric shredded and faded to a pale, ghostly blue. Poking out of the dirt beside it was another, this one a muddy, rotten green. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. With a trembling hand, he radioed his supervisor as his eyes scanned the disturbed soil. It was then that he saw it. Sticking out of the dark earth, clean and white against the dirt, was something that looked unmistakably like a human bone. Construction stopped cold. The roar of machinery was replaced by an unnerving silence, broken only by the chirping of insects and the frantic squawk of the foreman's radio. The forest had finally decided to give up its dead. Detective Miles Corbin, now gray at the temples and carrying the weight of 2 decades in his weary eyes, stood at the edge of the yellow police tape. The sun beat down on the freshly scarred earth, and the air was thick with the smell of pine and diesel fuel. He was the head of the county's cold case unit, a position that often felt more like an archivist of sorrow than an officer of the law. When the call had come in, he knew. Before the dispatcher even finished the location, he knew it was them. The Blackwood Three. The case that had defined his early career, the failure that had haunted his sleep for 20 years, had just clawed its way out of the ground. He ducked under the tape, his boots sinking into the soft, excavated soil. The scene was a controlled chaos of forensic technicians in white Tyvek suits, carefully sifting through the dirt under a portable canopy. The construction site, a testament to modern progress, had become a grave. The land, he noted with a grim irony, was the centerpiece of the new Blackwood Peaks Resort, the magnum opus of Alastair Finch. Corbin had seen Finch on the news just last week, breaking ground with a golden shovel, promising a new era of prosperity for the region. Now, that prosperity was being built on a tomb. He approached the lead forensic anthropologist, a woman named Dr. Eris Thorne. She looked up from her work, her face grim. "It's them, Miles," she said, her voice low. "We found 3 distinct sets of remains. Preliminary assessment of the dentition on one of the skulls is a likely match for Chloe's dental records." Corbin just nodded, his throat tight. He looked at the shallow pit where the bodies had been unearthed. They weren't scattered. They were clustered, buried together in a way that spoke not of a tragic accident, but of a deliberate, hasty concealment. A fall from a cliff would have sent them sprawling. An animal would have dragged them apart. This was a burial. A crude, shallow one, but a burial nonetheless. This wasn't an accident, was it? Corbin asked, though he already knew the answer. Dr. Thorne shook her head, pointing with a gloved finger toward a partially excavated skeleton. "Look, the cranium on this one, likely the taller male, Ben. See that depressed fracture? And the ulna on the female, a perifracture." She tried to block a blow. The clinical terms hung in the hot, still air, painting a violent, terrible picture. They hadn't gotten lost. They had been murdered. The revelation settled in Corbin's chest like a block of ice, extinguishing the last embers of the old, sad theories. This wasn't just a recovery mission anymore. It was a homicide investigation. He stood there for a long time, the ghosts of the past rising around him. He saw the eager faces of the 3 students from their missing posters, their lives brimming with promise. He felt the familiar, bitter sting of failure from 20 years ago. But now it was mixed with something new, a cold, hard resolve. The investigation hadn't ended in 1999. It had just been waiting. He turned his gaze toward the distant peaks, the same mountains that had held their silence for so long. The questions were no longer where, but who, and why. Back in his office, the relentless hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to mock the silence of the old case files spread across his desk. The boxes, brittle with age, released a dusty, papery smell as Corbin lifted their lids. He was surrounded by the ghosts of 1999. Grainy photos of the search teams, topographical maps marked with futile grids, and stacks of witness statements filled with dead ends. For 2 decades, these files had been a monument to failure. Now, they were a roadmap. He spent hours poring over the details, his mind sifting through the forgotten minutiae, searching for a dissonant note he might have missed as a young, inexperienced trooper. He read the original interviews with the victims' friends and families, their words heavy with fear and confusion. He retraced the planned route on the map, a winding path through canyons and over ridges that, according to every expert at the time, was well within the trio's capabilities. The official narrative had been so simple, so tragically plausible. But Dr. Thorne's words echoed in his head: perifracture, depressed fracture. The simplicity had been a lie. A call from the medical examiner's office confirmed it. Dr. Thorne's field assessment was correct. All 3 victims had suffered extensive blunt force trauma to their heads and upper bodies. The cause of death was unequivocally homicide. The knowledge settled the frantic energy in Corbin's gut into a cold, hard point. This changed everything. He needed to re-interview everyone, but this time he wouldn't be asking where they thought the hikers went. He would be asking who might have wanted them dead. His first call felt both necessary and profoundly uncomfortable. He scheduled a meeting with Alastair Finch. It was a courtesy, he told himself. Finch had been a central figure in the original search, and his company owned the land where the bodies were found. It was a logical first step. Finch's corporate headquarters occupied the top 2 floors of the tallest building downtown, a tower of glass and steel that reflected the mountains he was so intent on conquering. The office was a study in control power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Blackwood Range, the very peaks that had been the backdrop to the tragedy now serving as a stunning corporate mural. Alastair Finch, older but still radiating the same confident charisma Corbin remembered, rose from behind a massive mahogany desk to greet him. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. "Detective Corbin," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "A terrible, terrible business. When my foreman called me, I was just devastated. Those poor children. To think they were there all this time." He gestured for Corbin to sit, his expression a mask of somber concern. "Anything I can do, anything at all. You have my full cooperation. My company's resources are at your disposal." Corbin sat, the leather of the chair cool against his back. He watched Finch closely as he recounted the discovery. He noted the way Finch's hands remained perfectly still on his desk, the way his gaze was steady, his grief seemingly profound. It was a perfect performance. Too perfect. Corbin began asking routine questions about the land acquisition, the construction schedule, security protocols. Finch answered every one with rehearsed precision. But when Corbin shifted the topic back to the 1999 search, a flicker of something, a brief, almost imperceptible tension, crossed Finch's face. "You led the volunteer effort," Corbin stated, his tone neutral. "You were hailed as a hero. You must have known that terrain better than anyone." Finch gave a modest, self-deprecating smile. "I just did what anyone would do. That forest is my home. I knew it well, yes. We searched everywhere, detective. Every ridge, every ravine. It's inconceivable we missed them." Corbin leaned forward slightly. "The spot where they were found. Did you search that specific area?" Finch's eyes, for the first time, shifted away, landing on the distant mountain peaks outside his window. "That canyon? Of course. I searched it myself. It was treacherous, then a real mess of deadfall and unstable rock. There was nothing there. Absolutely nothing. It must have been a landslide later on that covered them so completely." His answer was smooth, logical. But the brief eye contact break, the subtle defensive edge in his tone, it was a tell. A gambler's tell. Corbin's intuition, the gut feeling that had guided him through countless interrogations, screamed that something was wrong. Alastair Finch was not just a concerned citizen. He was hiding something behind his wall of wealth and respectability. As Corbin left the sterile, opulent office and stepped back into the gritty reality of the city, he knew this was no longer a cold case. It was a hunt. And he had the unnerving feeling he had just met his prey. The forensic lab was a world away from the grandeur of Finch's office. Here, under the sterile glare of white light, the truth was stripped down to its bare elements. Dr. Thorne's team had spent days meticulously examining every scrap of evidence recovered from the shallow grave. The victim's gear was laid out on steel tables, rusted canteens, the tattered remains of sleeping bags, a compass with its glass face shattered. These were the mundane artifacts of a life cut short, each one a silent testament to the final, terrifying moments of the Blackwood Three. Corbin walked through the lab, the quiet hum of scientific equipment a stark contrast to the violent story the evidence was beginning to tell. He stopped at a table where a technician was painstakingly cleaning mud from the contents of Liam's backpack. Most of it was what you'd expect: a waterlogged book of poetry, a disposable camera, a bag of trail mix turned to petrified mush. But then the technician paused. Using a pair of delicate tweezers, she pulled a small, heavy object from a seam in the rotted canvas liner, where it had been wedged for 20 years. She placed it in an evidence bag. It was a lighter. Not a cheap plastic one, but a solid, heavy block of silver, tarnished almost black with age and moisture. As she wiped away a layer of grime, a detail emerged that made the air in the room feel electric. An ornate, swirling monogram was engraved on its surface, a single, elegant letter F. Corbin stared at it. "Did any of the victims smoke?" he asked, his voice low. The technician shook her head, already checking the old files on her computer. "No." And their families confirmed it at the time. Liam was asthmatic, Chloe and Ben were athletes. "More importantly," she added, pointing to the lighter, "this is a vintage Dunhill. Even new, it would have been worth several $100s. Not something a trio of broke college students would be carrying. This was it, the anomaly, the single, out-of-place object that shattered the established narrative. This lighter didn't belong to the victims. It belonged to their killer. The F was a tantalizing clue, a direct link to the unknown subject. But F could stand for anything, any name. It was a lead that was simultaneously monumental and frustratingly vague. Driven by a new sense of urgency, Corbin arranged to meet with the victims' families again. These were the hardest conversations a detective ever has to have. Delivering the news of the discovery was like reopening a wound that had never truly healed. He sat in 3 different living rooms, each a shrine to a lost child, and watched as 20 years of uncertain grief solidified into the hard, brutal reality of murder. He was there to offer condolences, but he was also there to hunt for clues. He showed a photo of the lighter to each family. None of them recognized it. But as he sat with Chloe's mother, a frail woman with her daughter's bright eyes, she provided the second piece of the puzzle. After he had explained the new evidence, she grew quiet, her gaze distant. Chloe called me from a payphone a few days into their trip, she recalled, her voice trembling. She was upset. She mentioned an argument they'd had with some man on the trail, a man in a fancy truck. She said he was arrogant, too, pushy, and acted like he owned the mountain. She was angry that he had tried to order them off a path they were on. I told her to be careful, but she just laughed it off. She was so headstrong. She had told this to the police in 1999, but without a name or a license plate. The information was buried in the avalanche of useless tips. Now it was different. Corbin felt a jolt of connection. A man who acted like he owned the mountain, a luxury vehicle, and a monogrammed silver lighter with the letter F. The pieces were starting to align, pointing in a terrifying direction. The image of Alastair Finch, sitting in his penthouse office with the entire Blackwood Range framed behind him like a personal possession, flashed in Corbin's mind. The pieces were circumstantial, a ghost of a theory built on a gut feeling. An initial, an offhand comment, a man's powerful demeanor. It was smoke. But Corbin knew that where there was smoke, you just had to dig long enough to find a fire. He began to dig into Alastair Finch, not as the philanthropist and business mogul of 2019, but as the man he was in 1999. He pulled old financial records, property deeds, and newspaper archives, working late into the night, fueled by black coffee and a growing certainty that he was on the right path. The picture that emerged was starkly different from Finch's carefully curated public image. 20 years ago, Finch wasn't a titan of industry. He was a desperate man. His company, Finch Developments, was heavily leveraged and on the verge of collapse. His dream of building a ski resort, the very same one now under construction, was his last gamble to save himself from financial ruin. Central to his plan was a large parcel of protected watershed land, the same land where the bodies were discovered. In 1999, that land was untouchable, protected by strict environmental regulations. Acquiring it was impossible. Corbin found a series of articles in the local paper from that year detailing Finch's fierce, but failing public campaign to have the area rezoned. He was losing. Environmental groups and a state oversight committee had blocked him at every turn. His project was dead in the water. Then, a few years later, after the furor over the missing hikers had died down, something strange happened. The lead environmental advocate on the state committee took a new, high-paying job out of state. The committee's position softened, and the land was quietly rezoned. Finch acquired it for a fraction of its future value. The timing was suspicious, but it wasn't a crime. Corbin needed a direct link, a moment in time where Finch's world could have collided with the hikers. He found it buried deep in the county sheriff's archives, a digitized incident report from a park ranger, filed on October 5, 1999, 2 days before the hikers were last seen. The ranger had been patrolling a restricted access road near the protected watershed. He had come across a heated argument. On one side, 3 young hikers matching the descriptions of Liam, Chloe, and Ben. On the other, an unidentified man in his late 40s with a new, dark green luxury SUV. The man was yelling at the students, telling them they were trespassing. The hikers were arguing back, pointing to their map. The ranger intervened, separated them, and filed the report as a minor disturbance. The complaint was never followed up. The description of the man was generic: white male, approximately 6 feet tall, well-dressed. But the vehicle was specific. A 1999 Lincoln Navigator, dark green. Corbin felt a chill run down his spine. He ran a DMV search. In 1999, Alastair Finch was the registered owner of one vehicle, a dark green 1999 Lincoln Navigator. It all clicked into place with a sickening thud. The hikers hadn't just been on the wrong trail. They had been on Finch's land. Or rather, the land he was determined to make his. Corbin imagined the scene. The 3 idealistic students stumbling upon something they shouldn't have seen. Maybe Finch was illegally surveying the land or clearing brush, something to bolster his case for development or to begin work before he had the permits. An argument would have ensued. The defiant, headstrong Chloe, as her mother described her, would have challenged him. And Finch, a man on the brink of financial and social ruin, with his entire future hanging in the balance, would not have tolerated being exposed by a group of college kids. His temper, fueled by desperation and arrogance, would have flared. The man who owned the mountain would have decided to prove it. Corbin now possessed a powerful theory, a narrative of greed and violence that explained everything. The location of the bodies, the motive, the opportunity, it all pointed directly at Alastair Finch. He pictured it clearly, a confrontation that escalated into a shocking act of violence, followed by a hasty burial. But the most brilliant, most sinister part of the plan came next. Finch didn't flee. He did the opposite. He inserted himself into the very heart of the investigation, taking control of the volunteer search. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. As the charismatic, grieving community leader, he could ensure no one ever looked in the right place. He could personally guarantee his secret remained buried. Corbin pulled the original search team logs from 1999, the binders filled with daily assignments and color-coded maps. He began to cross-reference the search grids with the location of the burial site. A disturbing pattern emerged. Alastair Finch had systematically and consistently directed every single search team away from the small, isolated canyon where the bodies were found. The logs were filled with his authoritative notes. Canyon Section 7B geologically unstable, avoid, high probability of rock slides in 7B, too dangerous for teams. I've personally cleared Section 7B, nothing to report. At the time, it had looked like responsible leadership, a seasoned outdoorsman protecting his volunteers from unnecessary risk. Now, 20 years later, it looked like a calculated, meticulous cover-up. But logs and theories weren't enough to get a warrant to search the home of the most powerful man in the county. He needed to talk to someone who was there, someone whose memory might hold the key. He found a name on the volunteer roster. A man named George Maxwell, a retired electrician who had been on the search party nearly every day. Corbin found George living in a small, tidy house on the outskirts of town. He was old now, his memory a little faded, but his recollection of that search was sharp. He remembered Alastair Finch vividly. Oh, yeah, Mr. Finch. He was in charge, George said, sipping a cup of tea Corbin had accepted. He was a real take-charge guy. Knew those mountains like the back of his hand. We all looked up to him. Corbin leaned forward, his voice steady. George, do you remember a place they called Canyon 7B? A small ravine on the west side of the ridge. George's brow furrowed in thought. Vaguely. I remember we were never allowed to go in there. Finch was real firm about it. He paused, looking out his window. You know, one of the younger guys, a hothead, wanted to go in anyway. Said it was the most likely place for someone to get trapped. Finch overheard him. I've never seen a man get so angry, so fast. He got right in that kid's face, told him if he went in there, he'd be off the search for good. Said he'd already been through it top to bottom, and it was a waste of time and a death trap. He was frantic about it. We all just figured he knew best. He was Alastair Finch, after all. Frantic. The word hung in the air. It wasn't the behavior of a concerned leader. It was the behavior of a guilty man terrified of being discovered. Corbin knew he was close, but he still needed something physical, something that couldn't be explained away. He called Dr. Thorne at the forensics lab. "Eris," he said, "I need you to look at the victim's clothing again. Specifically Chloe's jacket. Forget 1999 technology. Use everything you have now. Mass spectrometry, microscopic fiber analysis, anything. I'm looking for trace evidence. Something that doesn't belong on a mountain." The wait was agonizing. 2 days later, his phone rang. It was Dr. Thorne. Her voice was calm, but electric with discovery. "You were right, Miles. We found something. Embedded deep in the weave of her jacket's cuff, we found 7 microscopic fibers. They're not from any kind of outdoor gear. They are a specific blend of wool and synthetic, and the dye is a custom pigment. We cross-referenced it with an automotive database. The fibers are a perfect match for the high-end leather and fabric upholstery package offered on only one vehicle in 1999, the Lincoln Navigator." Corbin closed his eyes. It was the final nail. He had him. The warrant was a thing of beauty, a legal document authorizing him to tear apart the pristine, ordered world of Alastair Finch. The convoy of unmarked police cars pulled up the long, winding driveway to Finch's estate just as dawn was breaking, the soft morning light glinting off the polished marble of the entryway. The home was less a house and more a fortress, a modern castle overlooking the valley. Corbin, warrant in hand, knocked firmly on the massive oak door. Finch answered himself, dressed in a silk robe, a look of mild annoyance on his face that quickly curdled into theatrical outrage as Corbin presented the document. "This is an absurdity," Finch boomed, his voice echoing in the cavernous foyer. "My lawyers will have your badge for this, Corbin. You are harassing a private citizen." "We have a warrant to search the premises for evidence related to a triple homicide, Mr. Finch," Corbin said, his voice flat and unmoved by the threats. "You can either step aside, or we can add obstruction of justice to the list of charges." Finch's face flushed with anger, but he yielded, stepping back as the team of detectives and forensic specialists filed past him. He stood, rigid and seething, as they began their methodical work, his mask of untouchable respectability beginning to crack at the edges. Corbin didn't join the search. Instead, he followed Finch into his study, the same room where they had first met. The vast window still framed the mountains, but today they seemed less like a backdrop and more like silent, looming judges. "You won't find anything," Finch spat, pacing in front of his desk. "This is a pathetic fishing expedition based on the ramblings of old fools and your own sad obsession with this case." Corbin remained standing, his presence a calm, immovable object in the storm of Finch's fury. "It wasn't a landslide, was it, Alastair?" he began, his voice low and conversational. "There was no blizzard. They didn't just get lost. They saw you, didn't they? Out on that protected land, doing something you shouldn't have been. Maybe you were clearing a path, maybe you were dumping something. Whatever it was, your entire future depended on it staying secret. But they saw you." Finch stopped pacing and glared at him, his eyes blazing. "You're delusional. Chloe argued with you," Corbin continued, ignoring him. "She wouldn't back down. So you lost your temper. You grabbed a tire iron from your navigator and you killed them. All 3 of them. Then you buried them and orchestrated the search to lead everyone away. It was brilliant, diabolical. But you made one mistake. You were a smoker back then, a collector, and you dropped your lighter. Just then, a young detective appeared at the study door, his expression tense. He held up a clear evidence bag. "We found this in his bedroom closet, Detective. A display case for a collection of antique lighters." Corbin walked over and took the bag. Inside the plush velvet lining of the case were dozens of lighters, each in its own form-fitting slot. Except for one, a single, empty depression in the velvet, shaped to hold a lighter of a very specific size. The young detective then held up a second bag. It contained a small leather-bound box, the kind a piece of fine jewelry would come in. It was the original manufacturer's case. Embossed in gold on the lid were the words Dunhill and a small ornate F. The set was incomplete. Corbin turned back to Finch, holding up the empty case. Then he pulled out another evidence bag, the one containing the tarnished, mud-caked silver lighter from Liam's backpack. He held them side by side. "I believe this belongs to you." The blood drained from Alastair Finch's face. The arrogant fury evaporated, replaced by a chilling stillness. He stared at the lighter, the ghost from his past, now lying in a plastic bag in the hands of the law. His carefully constructed world, built on a foundation of bone and lies, had just crumbled into dust. The interrogation room at the county jail was a universe away from Alastair Finch's study. It was small, windowless, and painted a soul-crushing shade of beige. The only furniture was a simple metal table and 3 chairs. All the power and influence Finch had wielded for 2 decades was meaningless here. Stripped of his tailored suit and his army of lawyers, he was just a man in an orange jumpsuit, his empire reduced to the 4 sterile walls of this room. He sat across from Corbin, not with the panicked terror of a cornered animal, but with a strange, unnerving calm. The mask hadn't just cracked, it had been discarded entirely. What was left was cold, pure, and utterly remorseless. "You're a very persistent man, Detective," Finch began, his voice devoid of any emotion. "It wasn't a compliment, it was a clinical observation. I underestimated you. I assumed, after all this time, that I was safe." Corbin didn't respond. He simply sat and watched, letting the silence press in. He knew he didn't need to ask questions anymore. The dam was broken. Finch would talk. It was a final arrogant act of a narcissist, wanting his genius to be acknowledged, even if it was the genius of his own evil. "It was a land, of course," Finch continued, his eyes focused on a point on the wall just past Corbin's shoulder. "Everything I have now, I owe to that land. I was bankrupt, utterly ruined. That resort was my only way out. I was trying to get a geological survey done, off the books. Bend the rules a little to prove the land was more suitable for development than the environmentalists claimed. I had to move fast." He paused, a flicker of irritation crossing his face, not at the memory of the violence, but at the memory of the inconvenience. And then they showed up, those kids, tramping through the woods like they owned the place. I told them to leave, politely at first, but they wouldn't listen. The girl, Chloe, she was the problem. Mouthy, self-righteous. She pulled out a camera, said she was going to report me for trespassing on protected grounds. Can you imagine the irony? He gave a short, dry, mirthless laugh. She threatened to undo everything. All my work, all my plans. Over a patch of dirt. I couldn't let that happen. It was a business decision. A loose end. Corbin felt a cold, not tighten in his stomach. The casual, dismissive way Finch spoke of 3 human lives as a loose end was more chilling than any scream or cry for mercy. "There was a tire iron in the back of my truck," Finch said, his voice as steady as if he were recounting a trip to the grocery store. "It was quick, messy but efficient. The boy, Ben, he tried to run. The other one, the poet, he just stood there, froze. It was pathetic, really." He leaned back in his chair, a look of detached pride on his face. "Burying them was the hardest part. The ground was rocky, but I managed. And the search, well, that was my finest hour, wasn't it? Leading all those hopeful, foolish people around in circles, while the evidence of my solution was right under their noses. I told them exactly where not to look, and they thanked me for it. They called me a hero." He finally looked at Corbin, his eyes empty of everything but a vast, chilling narcissism. There was no guilt, no regret, no fear. Only the profound annoyance of a master manipulator whose perfect crime had been undone by a single, careless mistake and one very, very persistent detective. The confession wasn't a breakdown. It was a final horrifying performance, a monologue delivered by a monster who had hidden in plain sight for 20 years, convinced of his own superiority until the very end. The headlines were stark, a testament to a community's shock and betrayal. Philanthropist Alastair Finch charged in 1999 Blackwood triple homicide. The hero was the monster. The story dominated the news cycle for weeks, a sordid tale of greed, deception, and murder that unraveled the pristine image of a man many had considered a local saint. The construction of the Blackwood Peaks Resort was halted indefinitely, the half-finished foundations standing like skeletal ruins against the mountain skyline. The land, once a symbol of Finch's ambition, was now consecrated ground, a permanent memorial to the lives he had taken. For Detective Miles Corbin, there was no victory parade, no triumphant celebration. There was only the quiet, heavy satisfaction of a promise kept. He met with the families of Liam, Chloe, and Ben one last time. He sat in their quiet living rooms, now filled with a different kind of sorrow, not the agonizing void of the unknown, but the grim finality of the truth. He returned to them the small, personal items recovered from a scene, artifacts of lives interrupted. To Liam's parents, he gave the waterlogged book of poetry, its pages now carefully separated and dried by the forensics team. To Ben's father, the shattered compass that had failed to guide him home. And to Chloe's mother, he returned a single silver earring found tangled in the threads of her jacket collar. There were tears, but there was also gratitude, a profound sense of release. "Thank you," Chloe's mother whispered, clutching the small piece of jewelry. "Thank you for bringing our children home." Justice, Corbin knew, would be handled by the courts. Finch would never see the outside of a prison again. But his work, the work that had begun for him as a young trooper filled with frustrated helplessness, was finally done. He had given them the one thing he couldn't 20 years ago: answers. In the evening, Corbin drove out to an overlook, the same one he had stood on countless times during the original search. He got out of his car and stood alone, looking out at the vast, silent expanse of the Blackwood National Forest. The sun was setting, painting the jagged peaks in hues of orange and purple. The mountains looked the same as they always had, majestic, imposing, and indifferent. But something had changed. The silence no longer felt like a secret being kept. It felt like peace. The case that had haunted him, the three young faces he could never forget, had finally been put to rest. He had stared into the face of a hidden evil and dragged it into the light. He had brought justice for the innocent. He stayed until the last sliver of sun disappeared behind a ridge, leaving the mountains in a deep, tranquil darkness. Then he got back in his car and drove away, leaving the ghosts of the Blackwood 3 to the quiet of the stars.